Even so, no decision was final. Supplies remained dangerously low. Morale wavered between resilience and collapse. Weather changes signaled another reason to fear staying. Storms erupted more often. Violent winds tore through treetops, and animal migration patterns seemed altered, forcing desperate hunts. Some believed the land itself rejected them. Others claimed the gods were showing anger. The truth was simpler. Vinland was not empty, not waiting, not theirs to mold. And Leif realized that history would judge him not only by courage, but by wisdom. In the weeks following the Silent River disaster, internal conflict grew sharper than any external threat. Before, every Viking saw themselves as adventurers driven by hope. Now, they questioned who they were and whether their cultural ideals still made sense in this distant world. Everything about Vinland challenged their identity. Inside Leif's butter, arguments filled the nights. One group, led by the fiercest warriors, believed that to leave Vinland meant surrender. They pointed to sagas describing heroes who fought impossible odds, claiming that their ancestors would dishonor them if they retreated. These men sharpened blades daily, insisting action must be taken, and soon. They even proposed a night raid into the forest to burn indigenous settlements, using surprise as leverage. Their logic centered on Viking tradition: be feared, not pitted. Opposing them stood the settlers whose hopes were never tied to conquest. Farmers, craftsmen, children, women. They envisioned homes, crops, cattle, and trade. To them, Vinland represented peace, not war. They believed departure was not cowardice, but wisdom, a return to Greenland where social structure and community already existed. They argued that exploration fulfilled its purpose. Vinland was discovered, charted, and understood as real. Most importantly, it could not be held by force. Caught in the middle were those who simply feared death. They saw numbers, not symbols. Indigenous forces outnumbered them by unknown margins. Scouts no longer returned with optimistic reports. They returned with silence or warnings. Many in camp believed the Indigenous alliance was preparing one more great attack, far larger than anything before. Staying might mean annihilation. This tension reflected deeper cultural transitions. Viking identity itself was changing. Across the Norse world, Christianity replaced Odin and Thor. Seafaring raids shifted into kingdom building. Exploration replaced pillaging. Leif, raised between old and new belief systems, embodied this evolution. Yet many Vikings in Vinland lived by the older codes: strength over compromise, honor above survival. At evening gatherings, men debated through clenched teeth. One shouted, "Do we call ourselves Vikings if we run?" Another answered, "We call ourselves fools if we die for soil that is not ours." The settlement pulsed with these clashing ideologies, neither side willing to fully concede. Into this storm stepped Leif Erikson, who recognized the stakes. He understood that factional division could kill them faster than indigenous arrows. So he called for calm and ordered constructive debate. He allowed each side to speak before the entire community, giving voice to both courage and caution. During these meetings, something remarkable happened. People began reassessing what it meant to be Viking. They realized courage was not limited to charging into war. It was also courage to admit vulnerability, to value loved ones over pride, to believe that survival could define legacy rather than only conquest. One night, a hunter stood and confessed he feared Vinland so deeply he could not sleep. Once, he believed battle would bring glory, but now he dreamed of his wife suddenly widowed, his children fatherless in a strange land. His honesty broke tension. It reminded others that they were not warriors of myth. They were human beings facing real mortality. Another voice came from a woman whose husband had died at Silent River. Instead of demanding vengeance, she begged the settlement to prioritize life over rage. Her plea silenced the hall. If we stay, more children will lose their fathers. We can return to Vinland in future generations with peace, not blood. This idea, that discovery did not require permanent occupation, changed minds. Many realized their mission was never about owning a continent. It was about proving the world continued westward. That goal was complete. They had sailed farther than anyone in Europe would for centuries to come. History, already written, did not require more dead. The division, though passionate, was not hateful. Vikings rarely fractured in a civil war. They saw disagreement as part of decision-making, not betrayal. But still, time pressed them. Every day spent debating increased danger. Every night without sleep made them weaker. By the end of the month, a new consensus formed. Not final, but leaning heavily toward withdrawal. They would prepare ships quietly, continue guarding, and wait for the right moment to decide definitively. Vinland remained beautiful, resource-rich, and unforgettable, but it was not safe. And in silence, people began whispering a truth they had never imagined before. Maybe Vinland was meant only to be touched, not held. When Leif Erikson finally admitted aloud that departure might be necessary, the camp changed dramatically. The tension that once felt like fire burning within the walls slowly cooled into melancholy acceptance. No one cheered. No one felt victorious. But the idea of survival, of seeing home again, brought comfort deeper than pride. Preparation for leaving required extraordinary coordination. First, the ships had to be inspected. Months of salt spray, storms, and winter cold had weakened planks, loosened nails, and scraped tar sealant from hulls. Without repair, a return voyage could doom them at sea. The Vikings hauled the ships onto wooden supports, scraping old pitch away, heating new tar and clay pots, and sealing every seam by hand. Men worked silently, each strike of the hammer echoing like a heartbeat in the crisp air. Next came logistical decisions. What to carry? They could not take everything. Timber collected in Markland filled the ship's hulls, but food stores were low. They had to balance precious wood resource with provisions needed for ocean passage. In the end, they agreed that Vinland would matter more. The timber symbolized purpose. Greenland desperately needed lumber for homes, boats, and trade. This was the prize that justified the entire expedition. Food could be rationed, what could not be replaced. Families began packing personal belongings, though most had little to carry. Clothing, carved keepsakes, simple tools, enough to preserve memory. Children asked whether they would see Vinland again. Parents had no answer. Some men collected Vinland's soil in small sacks, believing it a sacred symbol of achievement. Others carved names into trees, hoping future Norse explorers might one day read them. The emotional environment was layered. Warriors who once demanded vengeance now stared at the forest with quiet respect. Indigenous communities were not evil enemies to them. Not anymore. They were defenders of their homeland. Vikings began realizing they had misunderstood the relationship between people and land here. These forests, rivers, and animals were interwoven with indigenous culture, not resources to be claimed. That recognition marked a turning point in Viking worldview. History had taught them exploration, but Vinland taught them humility. The settlers held a final communal feast, not a celebration, but a farewell ritual. They shared remaining food, sang old songs, and told stories of their journey across the sea. Men spoke about the first sight of Vinland's beaches, the taste of wild grapes, the joy of discovery before conflict began. They chose to remember the beauty rather than the violence. That night around the fire, even the most hardened warriors shed tears, quietly wiping faces with sleeves when no one watched. Meanwhile, scouts continued to monitor indigenous presence. Tension remained high, but elders reported that large-scale assault seemed less imminent now. Indigenous communities had achieved their objective. Proving the land would not be taken easily. Seeing the Vikings preparing to leave likely eased anger. The probability of another attack decreased. Yet the Vikings did not let their guard down. They maintained watch shifts until the morning they planned to depart. Leif spent hours walking alone through Vinland's grasslands, imprinting every detail into memory. He touched tree bark rough beneath his palm, smiled at birdsong, and breathed deep the warm scent of coastal soil. In those private moments, he understood why this place had inspired such hope. Vinland was a land of promise, full of life and possibility. But possibility belonged to someone else. As the final night in Vinland approached, the camp stood quieter than ever. Children slept early. Warriors polished weapons not for battle, but because they believed equipment should return home with honor. The stars above glittered brighter than usual, reflecting across ocean waves. Leif stared at constellations and whispered a single vow. We will return, not as enemies, but as people ready to learn. The next dawn would begin the long voyage back to Greenland, carrying not just timber and discovery, but the first chapter of European connection to North America, a story that would one day reshape global maps and human imagination. Welcome to History Teller YT, where stories are not just told, they are lived. Today, we unfold one of the most extraordinary chapters of human exploration, a story that began 1,000 years before Columbus ever dreamed of crossing the Atlantic. This is the saga of Vinland, the Viking discovery of North America. In this journey, you will travel beside Leif Erikson, through icy Greenland waters, through fog-drenched oceans, and finally to the warm shores of a new world the Vikings called Vinland. You will witness how Norse explorers built settlements, traded with indigenous peoples, struggled against winter storms, faced hunger, fear, and unexpected friendship, and finally returned home with stories that changed world history forever. In these episodes, you will explore the hidden emotional lives of Viking settlers, the bravery of women who crossed the ocean, the birth of the first European child in North America, the clash in communication between Norse and Indigenous cultures, and the rise and fall of a settlement shaped by resource struggles, diplomacy failure, and environmental pressure. You will learn how archaeology proved Vinland real, how indigenous communities defended their land with intelligence and strategy, and how this lost chapter reshaped identity across Scandinavia and North America. So get ready, because what you're about to hear isn't a myth, and it isn't fantasy. It is real history, filled with courage, tragedy, science, politics, psychology, and human emotion. Welcome to the Viking world beyond the edge of the map. Welcome to Vinland. And welcome to History Teller YT, where history comes alive. Centuries before Leif Erikson was born, the Norse world was already shaped by cold seas, shifting ice, and a hunger for land and resources. The Viking Age officially began in the late 8th century, marked by raids on Britain and the coast of Europe. Yet those raids were not random violence. They were symptoms of a culture built around exploration, competition, and a belief that fate rewarded the bold. Scandinavia was not a rich agricultural paradise. It was rugged, mountainous, and often unforgiving. Harsh winters limited harvests, forcing communities to innovate or seek opportunity elsewhere. Viking society relied on honor, physical strength, and maritime skill to survive. Their gods, such as Odin and Thor, represented wisdom, storms, and courage, qualities needed to face the unknown. Long before the Vinland saga, Vikings had already crossed to the British Isles, Iceland, and into Russia through river networks, proving that boundaries existed only for the timid. By the 9th century, Viking longships became engineering marvels unmatched by any civilization at the time. They were fast, flexible, shallow-keeled vessels capable of crossing oceans or sliding up rivers. Their design demonstrated a belief that the sea was not a barrier, but a road. In Iceland, settlement exploded as families left Norway to seek more freedom, land, and trade opportunities. When Iceland filled, Greenland came next. Each move west represented a step toward the horizon, a step closer to North America. Families carried stories of new lands across the sea, rumors spoken by sailors who saw birds flying from the west, or driftwood unknown to Greenlandic forests. To the Norse mindset, these were not coincidences, they were invitations. Before Columbus was even imagined, the Vikings already believed the world stretched far beyond Europe. This mindset, ambition mixed with desperation, created the conditions that allowed Leif Erikson's voyage to become possible. He did not appear randomly in history. He inherited a legacy of daring exploration, one generation pushing farther than the last until the unknown world finally appeared within reach. The journey to Greenland was a critical step in the discovery of North America, and it began with a fiery man named Erik the Red, Leif Erikson's father. Erik was exiled from Norway for manslaughter and again exiled from Iceland for the same offense. Violence marked his reputation, yet exile shaped his destiny. Forced to leave Iceland, he listened to sailors' tales describing a massive land to the west. Rather than surrender to shame, Erik embraced curiosity. In 982 CE, he sailed into uncharted waters and discovered Greenland, a stark, icy place with patches of life along its coasts. Though colder and more difficult than Iceland, Erik saw potential. He named the island Greenland to inspire settlers, believing people would travel to a place that sounded fertile. His marketing worked. Hundreds of families followed him, founding farms, churches, and trade routes. The Greenland colony became the last great Norse settlement of the Viking world, and from its western edge, the sea stretched toward a mysterious horizon. Life in Greenland was demanding. The soil was thin and snow persisted for much of the year. Sheep, goats, and cattle struggled to feed on limited pasture. Winter, darkness, isolated communities, and hunger was never far away. Yet the settlers endured because they believed the world held more to discover. The colony became home to traders, farmers, hunters, and sailors. They built ships, imported iron, and exported walrus ivory and sealskins to Europe. They also heard rumors from Inuit peoples who spoke of lands farther west, lands full of thick forests. Greenland had few trees, meaning boats and buildings required imported wood. That wood was essential for survival, and suddenly stories of fertile ground beyond Greenland turned from myth into necessity. Without wood, Greenland's future could collapse. Thus, practical economics encouraged exploration. Into this frontier Leif Erikson was born, raised not in Norway's settled valleys, but in a world that stared across the sea every day. His childhood was filled with stories of ancestors who crossed oceans. Greenland sharpened him, teaching navigation, survival, and leadership. By the time he reached adulthood, the question was not should someone explore to the west. It was when and who would lead the attempt. Leif Erikson was the answer waiting to happen. Before the Vikings ever set foot on North American soil, their technology quietly changed the world. Viking longships, carved from oak and ash, were masterpieces of design. Fast, flexible, and astonishingly lightweight, these vessels could survive storms that would destroy heavier ships. Their shallow keels allowed navigation in depths barely reaching 3 feet, letting explorers travel up rivers as easily as they crossed oceans. The combination of a square sail with strong rowing benches meant speed and mobility unmatched until centuries later. No European kingdom possessed anything comparable in Leif's lifetime. Navigation techniques reflected generations of observation. Vikings steered using sunstones, crystals that allowed sailors to locate the sun's direction on cloudy days through light polarization. They used ravens released from ship decks to find land. If the bird returned, land was distant. If it did not, land was near. They memorized wave patterns, wind direction, and the color of the sea, using senses modern sailors rarely rely upon. These skills were not myths, they were survival technology. Long-distance travel demanded mental mathematics, instinct, and fearlessness. To cross from Iceland to Greenland and later to North America, sailors needed meticulous discipline. They followed latitude sailing, maintaining the same east-west level by tracking the sun's height at noon. This simple observational strategy was centuries ahead of its time. Social structures also supported exploration. Norse culture celebrated travelers through saga storytelling. Heroes gained respect not only by fighting, but by discovering new lands. Communities invested in voyages expecting economic reward. Every expedition risked lives and ships, but the potential gain, land, timber, prestige, motivated them. When word spread that land might exist west of Greenland, people did not laugh or doubt. They prepared ships, collected crews, and armed themselves for possibilities. Religion played its role too. Vikings believed the world was filled with unknown realms. Odin wandered between worlds seeking wisdom. Thor traveled to distant lands facing giants. These myths taught that boundaries were illusions. By the time Leif Erikson reached adulthood, the idea of sailing across the Western Sea did not seem insane. It felt like fulfilling destiny. The stage was set. Greenland's hunger for timber, Viking confidence in technology, and a cultural hunger for fame formed the perfect conditions. Leif Erikson was ready to look west, not with fear, but with expectation. In the next part, his historic voyage will begin. Leif Erikson was born into a world already shaped by turmoil, exile, and adventure. His father, Erik the Red, had carved a settlement on Greenland through force of will, and young Leif grew up surrounded by people who believed that the world was not something to accept passively. It was something to conquer. As a child, Leif listened to stories told by Icelandic skalds visiting Greenland. These poets recited sagas of gods who traveled between worlds, of warriors who crossed seas to test their fate, and of men who challenged death itself. These stories were not mere entertainment for a Viking boy. They were a blueprint for how a man should live. The sagas taught courage, loyalty, and the importance of standing apart as an individual. Greenland itself shaped Leif's physical strength and mental discipline. Winters could last 8 months, trapping families inside their turf-roofed homes. Food was rationed carefully, and every member of a household needed to work from a very young age. Children helped collect driftwood from dangerous coasts, prepared seal skins, salted fish, and learned to navigate icy terrain on foot. Leif quickly understood survival not as an abstract concept, but as daily life. He learned to hunt seals from small boats and to follow animal tracks across snowfields. He saw death early, neighbors who froze during winter storms or starved when harvest failed. Such hardships created resilience, sharpening Leif's understanding that fortune favored those who seized opportunity rather than waiting for it. His education was both practical and moral. The Norse believed deeply in honor, and children were raised to respect family reputation. Erik the Red may have been a violent exile, but he also embodied leadership. He negotiated with chiefs, planned settlements, and made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Leif watched his father lead Greenland's community, learning diplomacy and confidence. Scholars believe Leif developed a calm, controlled personality, very different from Erik's fiery temper. While his father resolved conflict through force, Leif learned to weigh choices carefully. This balance between harsh Viking tradition and thoughtful leadership made him ideal for later exploration. One crucial influence was Greenland's isolation. With limited farmland and almost no trees, the settlers constantly searched for resources that could support long-term life. Wood was so rare that families reused beams for generations, and broken boats were dismantled to repair homes. Because of these shortages, sailors who returned from Iceland or Norway brought news of western shores covered in vast forests. The journey demanded a ship strong enough to handle open ocean waves, yet flexible enough to navigate potential coastal shallows once land appeared. Leif selected a sturdy Nar, a merchant ship wider and deeper than a longship, designed specifically for heavy cargo and long distances. It would carry supplies, timber back to Greenland, and possibly even settlers. Such a vessel symbolized intention. Leif was not heading west merely to explore. He hoped to establish a foothold in new territory. The crew gathered carefully. Leif did not recruit random warriors. He chose men with experience navigating harsh waters. Many had sailed from Norway to Greenland and Iceland, journeys that demanded endurance and courage. These sailors were hunters, carpenters, navigators, and farmers, representatives of a community, not just adventurers chasing glory. Some crew members hoped to claim land if new territory existed. Others sought wealth or simply wished to escape the limitations of Greenlandic life. Yet all believed in Leif's leadership for his reputation as Erik the Red's son carried weight, but so did his calm judgment. He was neither reckless nor timid, and his ability to maintain composure in danger inspired trust. Supplies must have included dried fish, smoked meat, oats, ale, and water sealed in wooden barrels. They packed tools, axes for timber, knives, fishing equipment, wool blankets, rope, spare oars, and materials for repairing the ship mid-journey. They brought glass beads and metal items for trade, not knowing who or what they would encounter. Their mental preparation was immense. They expected storms, cold, sleepless nights, and the possibility that they would never return. Yet to Vikings, death in pursuit of discovery carried honor. One of the most significant preparations involved choosing the right season. They had to wait until summer reduced sea ice, but they needed enough time to explore before autumn storms returned. The final days before departure unfolded with a surreal mixture of urgency and calm. After months defined by fear, conflict, and sleepless nights, the decision to leave Vinland gave the Vikings a clarity they had not felt since arriving. Each sunrise carried a sense of countdown. Each sunset a reminder that their time in this strange new world was nearly finished. Yet in those last days, Vinland seemed more peaceful than ever. Birds gathered in the trees near Leaf Sputter, singing melodies that drifted lazily through the warming air. Rivers, once frozen over in winter, now carried clear water sparkling beneath sunlight. Spring flowers pushed through soil around the settlement walls. Everything that had once felt dangerous now appeared beautiful. The Vikings could not help but see irony in this. In the beginning, they had prayed for rich land, calm weather, and fertile soil. Vinland offered all of it. But the human world, not the natural environment, made their stay impossible. They stood inside paradise, yet their hearts were heavy. Leaving felt like walking away from a dream at the moment it began to unfold. As the settlement dismantled itself, every step became symbolic. Houses that once echoed with children's laughter and late-night conversations were emptied. Tools were packed away. Walls, once a line of defense, were abandoned to vines and grass. Some men carved names and dates onto wooden beams inside Leif's Hall, knowing that if future Norse travelers ever returned, these markings would prove that people once lived and breathed here. The settlers cleaned the camp meticulously. Vikings believed in leaving order behind, not chaos. They buried leftover bones, extinguished fire pits, secured doors, and stacked stones over storage pits, hoping nothing would attract animals. They also removed metal objects from the site, things too precious to leave for chance discovery. Taking iron home mattered enormously to Greenland. The crew studied sky color, animal migration, and ocean current patterns. Viking navigators used a system of maintaining a constant latitude by tracking the sun's height at noon. They practiced their calculations, rehearsed rowing shifts, and planned leadership roles aboard the ship. Most striking of all was their acceptance of uncertainty. They relied on fate, what Vikings called WIRD. They believed that bravery shaped destiny, and that Odin watched over explorers. Leif did not promise wealth or success, only the chance to seize greatness before others did. The crew agreed. Greenland gathered to watch the preparation, whispers spreading that a new world might lie just beyond the sea. They did not know that history was changing as they packed the final ropes and sails. The morning Leif Erikson set sail west from Greenland must have been filled with tension and silent hope. Families stood along the shoreline, staring at the Nar as it rocked gently with the tide. Women carried baskets of dried fish and wool cloaks to the ship, offering final gifts of comfort. Children, some crying and some cheering, memorized the faces of fathers and brothers who might never return. Viking voyages were dramatic events that touched entire communities, not private adventures. Leif's departure represented Greenland's future. If his mission succeeded, new land could transform life for all. If he failed, the colony's hopes would dim. The ship carried around 35 crew members, though exact numbers remain debated. They were packed tightly between cargo and equipment, sleeping among ropes and barrels. Before sailing, priests offered Christian blessings while older Greenlanders invoked the old gods. This dual religious identity defined the moment. The community stood between ancient Viking belief and a shifting world. Some prayed to Odin for wind, others made the sign of the cross, and many did both. Old winds and fear. Without moons or stars, direction was harder to fish than are pushed away from the shore. Oars dipped silently into the ocean, and Greenland faded behind them. The sea was calm at the start, but no Viking expected smooth travel. They knew the journey could take weeks, possibly longer, depending on storms and currents. The ship traveled west-northwest, aiming for where Bjarni Herjolfsson once sighted land. Men took turns rowing, steering, and scanning the horizon. Viking ships demanded constant labor. Sails had to be trimmed, ropes tightened, and water drained from decks after waves crashed over the sides. Salt spray coated clothing and skin, stiffening wool and burning eyes. Night brought Kutch. Storms erupted suddenly, waves towering over the ship like mountains. The Nar creaked, groaned, and bent with every impact. Crew members bailed water with wooden buckets, muscles trembling. They tied themselves to the ship during rough weather to avoid being thrown into the dark sea. Viking sea chants rose through the night, not to entertain, but to maintain rowing rhythm and steady the heart. Yet even amid hardship, hope grew. Some days the sea offered signs, driftwood bobbing in currents, unfamiliar birds circling overhead. These moments electrified the crew. If birds flew overhead, land could not be impossibly far. Men argued about what awaited them. Strange animals, towering forests, perhaps people unlike any they had ever seen. They imagined fertile soil, rivers full of salmon, valleys where cattle could graze. For Greenlanders, such a world represented paradise. During calmer days, Leif walked among his men, speaking quietly, offering encouragement. He ate the same food, rowed the same hours, and slept in the same cramped space. His equality strengthened loyalty. A leader who endured the same pain as his crew inspired devotion deeper than orders ever could. Some crew members wrote runes into wooden planks, recording prayers and names of loved ones. Others whispered to the sea, asking for mercy or guidance. The further they traveled, the more the horizon changed. Fog banks rolled in, cold and silent, hiding the world beneath white layers. Navigation became guesswork until the sun pierced the mist. Days stretched endlessly, but turning back was not an option. Pride, fear, ambition, and destiny all pushed them forward. Somewhere ahead, land waited. Whether salvation or death, none could know. And then, after countless days at sea, a sailor shouted. Shapes appeared in the distance. Not clouds, not ice, but something solid, unmoving, land. The ship roared with voices. They had reached the edge of a new world. Land came into view slowly, like a whisper turning into thunder. The coastline ahead looked harsh and formidable, a gray shape against the endless blue sea. The Viking crew, exhausted from weeks of rowing, stood speechless as the Nard drifted toward shore. They had crossed an ocean on instinct and courage, with only the stars, the sun, and memory to guide them. Now, before them, stretched a land no European had ever described in detail. The sagas later named this place Helgeland, meaning stone slab land, and modern historians believe it was likely the coast of Baffin Island. From the ship, the men could see towering cliffs rising sharply from the ocean, massive slabs of rock and stone that seemed ancient and untouched by human hands. Waves crashed violently against the shoreline, sending cold spray high into the air. The crew marveled, but they also felt uneasy. The land was barren and severe, without visible forests or fertile fields. It appeared colder than Greenland, the wind stronger, the landscape bleak and almost supernatural. But for these Vikings, the moment still held profound meaning. They had reached something beyond rumor and myth. Even if this land wasn't suitable for settlement, it proved the world extended farther west than any map suggested. Their hearts, despite fatigue, swelled with pride. They anchored offshore, too cautious to pull directly onto the rocky coastline, and spent hours studying their surroundings. The waves pounding the cliffs sounded like drums, and the mist wet their clothes. Yet the men stared at the strange new world with awe. Some crew members suggested exploring inland, hoping to find fresh water or animals. Others urged caution, reminding everyone of Bjarni Herjolfsson's warning years earlier. Western lands did not necessarily mean safety. Their supplies remained strong, and Leif, ever thoughtful, decided to stay only briefly at this first location. He scanned the environment carefully, searching for trees that could help Greenland. But the shoreline revealed little vegetation beyond hardy shrubs and patches of dry tundra grass. Without lumber, there was no reason to remain. Still, Leif commanded a landing party to step onto the shore. The first humans of Europe to set foot here left footprints in sand and stone, marking a turning point in world history. They carried axes, shields, and knives, wary of the unknown. Silence surrounded them. No birds sang, no animals called, only the wind howled. The emptiness felt eerie and wonderful. Some men knelt and prayed. Others collected stones as souvenirs. The moment mattered not because the land was useful, but because it confirmed their voyage was working. As the crew returned to the ship, excitement buzzed through the group. The existence of Helgeland meant more land surely lay farther south, perhaps warmer and filled with resources. The coastline stretched endlessly, and sailors pointed toward distant horizons, debating what might lie beyond. That night, anchored offshore, they celebrated quietly, sharing dried fish and ale while staring at the strange dark shape against the stars. They knew this harsh region was unlikely to become a Viking home, yet they spoke its name with pride. They had stepped onto the edge of a new continent. Tomorrow they would sail again toward possibilities. After leaving Helgeland, the Vikings sailed south along the coastline, driven by hope of finding a gentler landscape. The sea currents pulled them smoothly, and though the air stayed cold, the horizon brightened with new promise. Days passed before the shoreline changed dramatically. Instead of barren cliffs, immense forests rose from the coast, stretching inland like dark waves of green. This land would later be called Markland, meaning forest land, believed to be Labrador or parts of northern Newfoundland. The men shouted with joy when they saw trees, an emotional response shaped by Greenland's scarcity of wood. For years, the colony had struggled to obtain enough timber for building houses, repairing boats, and crafting tools. Here before their eyes stood endless forests, spruce fir, birch, and pine, rising thick and tall. Some sailors wept openly, understanding how valuable this discovery would be for their families back home. They begged Leif to anchor and explore, their voices trembling with eagerness. The ship glided into a sheltered bay, calmer than the waters near Helgeland. They landed on a beach covered with soft sand and small stones. The smell of wet soil and pine needles overwhelmed them, an aroma most had not experienced since leaving Norway years earlier. Many pressed handfuls of earth to their faces, inhaling deeply. For Greenlanders, Markland felt like a dream. Leif, however, remained cautious. Though the area seemed rich and alive, he knew nothing of who or what lived there. Tracks of animals appeared quickly: bears, foxes, and perhaps caribou. The men gathered timber using their axes, chopping thick logs and dragging them to their ship. Even if they found nothing else during their voyage, bringing wood back to Greenland would make the expedition a success. They spent several days cutting wood, building piles beside the beach as though claiming the land through labor. They built temporary fires at night, roasting dried meat and fish while staring into the surrounding forest. Some feared hidden dangers. They whispered about spirits, giants, or monsters, imagining what might move between the trees. But the land remained silent except for rustling leaves and distant animal calls. Markland seemed untouched by human cultivation, wild, uncivilized, but alive with potential. At dawn, the men climbed hills overlooking the bay. They saw lakes inland and river mouths opening toward the sea. The landscape seemed warm compared to Helluland, though still colder than Iceland. The question arose, should they settle here permanently? Some argued yes. This was everything Greenland lacked. But Leif insisted they continue farther south. Bjarni Herjolfsson's story described land even greener, warmer, and more welcoming than this. Leif understood that if they stopped too early, they might miss something extraordinary. Still, they left Markland changed. They now knew the world beyond Greenland held resources capable of sustaining future colonies. They loaded as much timber as their ship could safely carry and carved runes into trees, marking that Norse hands had touched this place. Before departure, Leif gathered the crew and spoke of destiny, that they were not just travelers but pioneers of a new world. His voice echoed through the silent trees, and the men believed him. With hearts full of energy, they returned to the sea, turning their gaze toward the south. Somewhere beyond the horizon, their true destination waited. Vinland, the land of grapes, the land that would one day enter legend. After leaving Markland, the Vikings continued south, and the temperature slowly began to rise. The wind felt warmer on their faces, and the sea changed color, becoming clearer and more welcoming. For the first time since leaving Greenland, the men sensed not just the possibility of survival, but the potential for true comfort. Stories circulated through the ship. Sailors repeated Bjarni's tale about vines heavy with berries, warm rivers, and fertile soil. Each new rumor added to their anticipation, and they rowed faster, hearts pounding with excitement. Then, one morning, a green coastline appeared. Unlike Helluland's harsh cliffs or Markland's dense forests, this new region seemed open, balanced, and inviting. Meadows rolled inland, separated by small groves of trees. The beaches were soft and light-colored, shaped by gentle waves rather than violent storms. As the Vikings approached the shore, they spotted birds of many varieties, fish jumping near the surface, and rivers flowing from inland hills. This was the world they had hoped to find, a land that seemed almost designed for settlement. They named it Vinland, the land of wine or vines. Scholars debate whether the original word referred to grapes or meadows, but to the Vikings, the meaning was clear. This was paradise. The crew shouted and laughed, unable to contain their joy. The air smelled different here, warmer and sweeter. They disembarked on a soft grass, stunned by the richness of the soil beneath their boots. In Greenland, farming was a constant struggle. Here, crops could thrive without laborious stone removal. Streams tasted fresh and clean, perfect for drinking. Beyond the immediate coastline, the land rose gently into hills, dotted with lakes and forests. Everywhere they looked, the world seemed to welcome them. Soon, they discovered wild grapes or berries growing across the landscape, a detail Sagaland later emphasized. They gathered basketfuls of fruit, staining their hands purple, laughing like children at the abundance. The presence of these fruits suggested a much milder climate than Greenland, suitable for farming grain, raising cattle, and growing vegetables. They found salmon so large and plentiful that men swore they had never seen anything like them. Rivers overflowed with fish, and animals roamed freely across the hillsides. At night, they built fires near the shore, cooking their discoveries, staring up at stars that seemed brighter than back home. No one wished to return to the ship. Everyone preferred sleeping on land. The warmth encouraged dreams of families moving here one day. Men spoke of building farms, raising children, and living peacefully away from Greenland's icy hardship. Leif listened quietly, feeling pride swell within him. He believed they had found the future for their people. And yet, beneath this excitement, a new challenge gathered: contact with the original inhabitants of Vinland. Unknown to Leif and his crew, this paradise was not empty. It was part of a living continent filled with indigenous peoples who had flourished there for thousands of years. The next chapters of Viking history would not unfold on empty soil, but on land shared with others. For now, though, Vinland belonged to silence, starlight, and hope. The Vikings stood at the threshold of history, unaware that their discovery would one day reshape ideas about world exploration. They had crossed an ocean, found paradise, and written a new chapter in human courage. The Vikings' first days in Vinland were filled with overwhelming excitement and curiosity. Yet beneath those emotions lay a strong sense of responsibility. Leif Erikson knew that simply landing on the beaches and gathering berries would not be enough. To truly claim this place on behalf of the Norse world, they needed to explore, record what they discovered, and secure a safe base of operations. He ordered men to survey the coastline, taking careful note of the bays, cliffs, river mouths, and natural harbors. The coastline curled inward gently, forming shielded inlets that could protect ships even in winter. The calm seas near shore suggested safer access than Greenland, where ice could trap vessels against cliffs and destroy them. Teams of explorers walked day after day along the beaches, marking the distance traveled and carving symbols into tree trunks. They studied how tides moved, where the water reached at night, and which parts of the land sat above potential flood levels. All of this mattered for survival. The Vikings did not want to build homes in areas that could be destroyed by the sea. Their mapping process was primitive by modern standards, yet incredibly effective. They used memory, distance counting by footsteps, ship measurements taken from rope length, and the natural horizon for orientation. The descriptions later recorded in sagas came from these earliest surveys. Meanwhile, Leif ordered the construction of temporary housing near a river that emptied into the ocean. These structures were built using both ship timber and resources from nearby forests. The men cut straight tree trunks, stripped them of branches, and shaped them into beams using iron axes. Walls were built by overlapping logs horizontally, sealed with moss and mud to prevent freezing wind from entering. Roofs were covered with turf and grass, techniques well known in Greenland and Iceland. Though these shelters were small, they represented permanence. The Vikings were no longer travelers passing through. They were settlers beginning a new chapter. The camp became a central hub for activity. Fires burned day and night, filling the air with smoke and smell of roasted fish. Men shared stories, laughed, and planned their future explorations. Some believed Vinland could replace Greenland entirely. Its warmth, rich soil, and resources seemed limitless. For the first time in their lives, they saw grass taller than their knees and soil dark with nutrients. In Greenland, children grew up knowing starvation as a realistic possibility. Here, hunger seemed a distant memory. Their days were long and filled with chores. Groups collected wood, others hunted, while select scouts journeyed deeper inland to gather information about rivers, mountains, and weather patterns. They studied the stars each night to determine how far south they had come, knowing that warmer climates meant longer seasons for farming. Scientists today believe the Vikings reached an area significantly warmer than Greenland's northern climate, allowing grapes and berries to grow freely. During construction, men often paused to marvel at Vinland's birds. Ducks, geese, and songbirds filled the riverbanks with sound. Their presence indicated fertile wetlands nearby, which suggested agriculture could thrive. Fish thrived in astonishing numbers. Salmon were so large that crew members described them as wider than a man's waist. They constructed fishing weirs along river mouths, capturing dozens at a time. The food surplus created comfort and stability unlike anything the crew had ever experienced outside Norway. The base camp, later remembered as Leifsbutter, became a symbol of Viking determination. From this place, the Norse world would expand its knowledge of North America. Even though the Vikings did not yet know the continent's size, they sensed it stretched endlessly. Children ran along the beach collecting shells, unaware of the emotional weight among adults. Women packed clothing, stitched torn sails, and tightened leather straps. Some paused occasionally to stare across the water, try to memorize the sight of Vinland's horizon. One emotional event marked the final days, the dismantling of the camp shrine. Over the course of the settlement, people had built a place of prayer combining Christian and pagan elements. A wooden cross beside carved runes, animal bones near painted stones. This shrine represented the blending of old and new Viking identity. When the time came to destroy it, people gathered silently. Some prayed to Christ, asking safe passage. Others whispered names of Odin and Thor, requesting guidance. The shrine was not burned or buried. Instead, Leif ordered its pieces carried to the ships. He believed Vinland faith must continue aboard the ocean. Meanwhile, tension with indigenous peoples eased. Scouts observed fewer armed groups near the forest. In fact, the sightings that once shocked the camp now seemed distant memories. There were no more confrontations, no more nighttime movements. Either the Indigenous alliance saw victory in Viking departure or respected their choice to leave peacefully. That final silence between cultures carried far more meaning than words could. Each side accepted distance rather than death. On the evening before launching their ships, Leif walked alone through the settlement grounds. He moved slowly, touching walls, running his fingers along tree bark, kneeling beside footprints worn into the earth. These marks told a story he knew future generations would struggle to believe. Norsemen had stood here, lived here, fought here, and dreamed here 500 years before Columbus. When Leif returned to the shoreline that night, staring at the ships resting in moonlight, he knew the choice to leave was the right one. Vinland was not a failure. It was a truth revealed too soon. They had found a foothold on a frontier far larger than any European mind had imagined. With the coastal camp secured, Leif Erikson prepared for the next stage, sending groups inland to learn the land's secrets. These expeditions were not reckless wandering. They were structured attempts to understand the resources, terrain, and dangers that could affect future settlers. Groups carried food, fishing gear, bows, arrows, axes, and small shields. They also brought ropes, knowing that rivers, steep hills, and dense forests would require climbing or controlled descent. The first scouting teams traveled along the river nearby, discovering lakes so large they seemed endless. Waterfowl covered their surfaces, lifting into the air in enormous flocks when disturbed. The sight amazed the Vikings. In Greenland, lakes froze early each year, making fishing difficult, and wetlands were limited. Here, a man could cast a net into nearly any body of water and return with enough fish to feed a family. This abundance convinced many that Vinland could support a permanent community for generations. Travel inland also revealed fertile valleys with rich soil soft beneath their boots. Some men dug fingers into the dirt, whispering disbelief at how easily crops might take root. They imagined barley fields swaying in summer winds and cattle grazing freely across rolling hills. Vinland offered much more than survival. It offered prosperity. But the journey inland also presented difficulties. Thick forests slowed movement, and unfamiliar animals left tracks the Vikings could not identify. They found signs of deer and elk, but also claw prints from predators. Wolves howled at night, reminding explorers that nature here was powerful and unpredictable. They had to remain alert at all times. As summer passed into autumn, Leif shifted focus toward winter preparations. Despite the warm climate compared to Greenland, winter was still inevitable. They stored berries, dried fish, and smoked meat, knowing that fresh food might become scarce in colder months. They constructed larger buildings at Leifsbutter, one for sleeping, one for storing food, and another for crafting. Viking society ran like a machine, disciplined, organized, and efficient. Even in new lands, they recreated the comforting rhythm of home. Wake at dawn, hunt, gather wood, reinforce structures, carve tools, share stories, and sleep beneath the stars. The crew also discovered that daylight lasted longer in Vinland during summer than in Greenland. This gave them more working hours and boosted morale. Some fishermen traveled miles offshore to explore deeper waters, returning with stories of whales, seals, and enormous schools of cod. They believed Vinland could become a major trade center someday. Yet as winter approached, anxiety brewed. Some men feared storms would trap them. Others wondered if their clothing was warm enough. Greenland homes were built knowing generations of climate experience. Vinland was unpredictable. While nature had been generous so far, the Vikings remained cautious. Still, Leif reassured them. His leadership never faltered. He told them that winter would be a test, not a threat. Surviving winter would prove their strength to Greenland and Norway. His confidence spread through the crew, and men worked tirelessly to prepare defenses against snow and freezing winds. They sealed cracks in walls, thickened bedding with furs, and built extra fires. No one knew what the first Vinland winter would bring, but all believed they were ready. As the Vikings explored the region surrounding their camp, they documented an astonishing array of plants and animals unlike anything seen in their homeland. To men accustomed to Greenland's limited flora, Vinland felt enchanted. The blueberries and cranberries growing wild across open meadows amazed them. They tasted sweeter and fresher than berries preserved in Greenlandic ice cellars. They collected baskets full, storing them for the coming winter. Grapes, or grape-like berries, became a symbol of paradise, confirming legends told by Bjarni Herjolfsson. The forest teemed with life. Squirrels darted across branches, deer grazed in low grasslands, and a variety of birds filled the trees. Vikings were skilled hunters, and soon they learned patterns of animal movement. They discovered that deer traveled in herds, offering predictable hunting routes. Elk tracks indicated larger meat supplies deeper inland. Wolves, though dangerous, presented valuable fur opportunities. The men collected pelts, imagining a new trade market with Europe. Vinland furs could become priceless commodities. The soil also fascinated them. They found areas perfect for farming, flat and moist from river flooding. Viking farmers dreamed of growing wheat and barley to produce beer, bread, and grain stores without risk of famine. They even talked about raising cattle, confident the grasslands could feed herds year-round. One discovery held particular significance: iron-bearing bogs. In Scandinavia, bog iron played a crucial role in tool and weapon production. Finding similar resources in Vinland meant the settlers could potentially forge axes, knives, arrowheads, and nails independent from European supply chains. Such a breakthrough would allow Vinland to function as a self-sustaining colony. Beyond physical riches, the Vikings noticed psychological benefits of the land. The sunlight boosted morale, the warm breezes eased daily labor, and the lush environment inspired hope. Many men reported sleeping better than they ever had in Greenland. The constant anxiety of starvation faded away, replaced by dreams of prosperity and peace. But perhaps the most important discovery was evidence of other humans. Scouts reported signs of ancient fire pits inland, footprints near riverbanks, and sharpened stones that seemed deliberately shaped. The land was not empty. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples had lived in North America, and the Vikings were now stepping into their world. Leif ordered caution. He knew peaceful coexistence could allow trade and knowledge exchange, but he also understood that misunderstandings could lead to conflict. The silence surrounding these discoveries filled the air with tension. The Vikings whispered at night, wondering whether the people who lived here would be friendly or hostile. They questioned how many lived inland, what languages they spoke, and whether they understood outsiders. Some men feared attack, others hoped for alliances. For now, the Vikings continued their work, pretending not to worry, but in their hearts they sensed that history was shifting again. They had discovered a world rich in resources beyond imagination, but they had also stepped into a land already claimed by others. What came next would define the future of Vinland and shape the legacy of the Norse discovery of North America for centuries to come. As the Vikings settled deeper into Vinland, their awareness of unseen inhabitants grew stronger each day. Signs of human presence were everywhere, though the people themselves remained invisible. At first, the Norse simply found footprints near rivers, prints smaller than Viking boots, but numerous and clearly fresh. Soon after, explorers discovered sharpened spear points made from stone, scattered near the tree line where wild animals had been butchered. This evidence sparked conversations among the men every night. Who were these people? What do they want? Were they hostile or curious? The sagas would later call them skrælings, a term meaning small people or outsiders, not intended to describe their size, but rather the Viking perception of cultural difference. The Vikings had no intention of provoking war, yet they understood danger intimately. Every man in Leif's camp carried weapons: long knives, axes, shields, and spears. Still, they were explorers, not raiders. Unlike European ventures centuries later, the Norse had no interest in conquering vast populations or claiming empires. Their goal was survival: find timber, farmland, and a safe winter colony. Because of this, Leif Erikson insisted that any first contact must be peaceful. But even peaceful intentions could not erase tension. One evening, as fog drifted between the trees, 2 scouts returned to camp with alarming news. They had seen movement, 3 figures in the distance, watching silently from a forest ridge. The scouts described the figures as lightly dressed for the climate, agile, and carrying bows. The sighting sent ripples through the camp. Some Vikings believed the observers meant no harm, simply studying newcomers. Others believed the figures represented scouting warriors. Leif gathered his crew and spoke calmly. He reminded them that Vinland was vast, and its people had likely lived here for countless generations. The Vikings were outsiders, strangers arriving uninvited to a land already full of culture, tradition, and ownership. Leif believed communication, not aggression, was the path to success. But communication required caution. He ordered guards to watch the forest edges day and night. He also instructed the men to avoid wandering alone or provoking unnecessary fear. Despite caution, a strange feeling settled over the camp. At night, the woods seemed alive with whispered voices, cracking branches, and distant fires glowing beneath starlight. Wolves howled from hillsides, but their calls blended eerily with what sounded like human footsteps. Sleep came slowly. Men placed their weapons beside their beds and built extra fires for comfort. The next morning, the Vikings discovered something remarkable. Near the river, someone had left carved wooden objects, perhaps toys or symbols. They were not threatening, merely mysterious. The unknown people had approached close enough to leave them, yet avoided visibility. The Vikings studied the carvings, astonished by their craftsmanship. These objects proved that indigenous communities possessed artistic traditions as complex as any in Europe. Still, fear lingered. The Vikings knew that history between strangers often began with misunderstanding, and misunderstanding led to violence. But Leif believed fate had guided them here not to shed blood, but to expand horizons. He instructed scouts to continue exploring carefully while the camp prepared for potential interaction. They began collecting trade items, metal tools, colorful beads, and woven cloth, objects that Vikings believed could impress local peoples. That night, as the sun dipped behind Vinland's hills, the camp fell silent. Every man stared into the dark tree line, waiting for the moment when strangers would step forward. They had crossed an ocean into a new world, but the next step into friendship or conflict waited only a breath away. The first direct meeting between Vikings and indigenous peoples in Vinland came abruptly, yet peacefully. According to reconstructed historical interpretation, the encounter likely happened near the riverbank where scouts collected fresh water. Early one morning, as mist hovered above the surface of the water, 3 indigenous individuals appeared at a distance. 2 men and a woman, each carrying woven bags and wearing clothing made from animal skins and plant fibers. Their skin complexion, hair texture, and facial features were unlike anything the Vikings had seen before. Yet the sight amazed them rather than frightened them. When the strangers approached, the Vikings froze. Every instinct told them not to raise weapons. Leif Erikson stepped forward slowly and lowered his axe, signaling peace. The strangers reacted cautiously, speaking in a language the Norse could not understand, rich with rhythm and tone, perhaps spoken through Algonquian or Inuit linguistic families, depending on region. The 2 groups stared at one another in silence, searching for meaning in gestures and facial expressions. Language became a barrier neither had prepared for. Leif smiled and offered beads, placing them on the ground between the two groups. The strangers hesitated, whispering among themselves, then accepted the beads with visible interest. Their eyes widened at the polished surfaces. Europeans had access to refined metals and glass not found naturally in North America. In return, the woman placed dried berries and carved antler pieces on the ground. The Vikings stepped back respectfully while she arranged them. This exchange, simple yet profound, became the first diplomatic act between Norse outsiders and indigenous Vinland inhabitants. The Vikings studied the strangers' clothing closely. They wore leggings reinforced with animal sinew, warm cloaks, and footwear lined with fur, beautifully designed to withstand winter. The clothing offered proof of indigenous mastery over the environment. While the Vikings brought techniques from Europe, these people had perfected local material use. Their craftsmanship revealed generations of cultural evolution. Communication remained slow. Each side used hand gestures, pointing to the land, the trees, the river. They drew shapes in the sand. The Vikings sketched their homeland's mountains. The strangers sketched canoes and fish. Through pantomime, they exchanged names of food animals: deer, salmon, seals. Although neither understood each other's words, meaning slowly emerged through shared symbols. That evening, the strangers retreated into the forest but did not disappear completely. They set up their own camp not far away, building fires that flickered through the trees. The Vikings could hear faint laughter and singing carried through the wind. The presence of music surprised them. It showed joy, community, and culture alive in Vinland long before Norse arrival. Over the following days, more friendly exchanges took place. The strangers returned with handcrafted arrows and small carved tools. The Vikings responded with metal objects, knives, nails, and fishing hooks. Soon, regular trade began, wood and food in exchange for materials and artistry. Yet beneath these peaceful beginnings lay cultural distance so vast it could not be ignored. The Vikings worshipped gods like Odin and Thor or Christ. The indigenous peoples held spiritual beliefs deeply connected to nature, animals, and ancestors. Their worldviews did not clash violently, but they did not align. The Norse saw land as a path to settlement and expansion. The indigenous people saw land as something sacred, not owned. Both sides acted respectfully, yet misunderstandings loomed like storm clouds, waiting for sparks to ignite conflict. But for a moment in time, peace prevailed. Vinland became a crossroads of two ancient worlds, neither superior to the other, both complex, intelligent, and human. Weeks passed, and trade between the Vikings and indigenous communities continued. But as contact deepened, so did tension. The Vikings remained cautious. They rarely allowed strangers inside their main camp, worried that too much openness could invite suspicion or vulnerability. Likewise, indigenous groups kept their distance, never revealing the full size of their population or homeland territory. There was politeness, but not trust. Conflicts began subtly. The Vikings valued metal above all things. Iron meant tools, weapons, and survival. Indigenous peoples, however, treasured furs, crafted weapon tips, and portable resources that mattered in their world. Though trade continued, each side grew protective of their assets. The Vikings wanted more animal skins. The indigenous people wanted more metal than the crew was willing to give. Resentment grew quietly. Language barriers heightened the problem. Without shared speech, small misinterpretations turned into emotional wounds. One day, a Viking attempted to barter for a beautifully carved bow. He pointed at the bow, then offered a small knife in exchange. The indigenous owner perceived the gesture as disrespectful. His weapon represented skill, culture, and personal pride. The knife seemed like an insultingly small payment. Voices rose. Though no violence erupted, both sides walked away angry. The Vikings began noticing more indigenous groups arriving from farther inland. Canoes appeared on rivers, holding warriors armed with bows. These newcomers studied the Norse from afar, whispering suspicions. The presence of steel weapons made the Vikings seem powerful, possibly threatening. The Norse, in turn, wondered if they were becoming surrounded. Winter preparations had intensified stress. The Vikings stored food in large wooden sheds, piling fish and berries high. Indigenous neighbors saw these stores and wondered why the newcomers hoarded so much, fearing scarcity they themselves did not feel. In many native cultures, sharing food was a sign of trust. The Vikings, unfamiliar with this expectation, saw the stores as essential for survival. Two different ethics collided: communal support versus individual preservation. Rumors spread inside the Viking camp. Some believed indigenous warriors were planning to attack. Others thought they simply wanted to understand these newcomers. Meanwhile, indigenous communities debated whether the Vikings planned to claim territory for themselves and erase the people who lived there. One night, arrows were found stuck into trees near Leif Sputter, clearly signs of warning or communication. The Vikings interpreted them as threats. Indigenous witnesses later generations might have understood them differently, perhaps messages urging caution. But fear translated symbols incorrectly. Despite rising tension, no blood had been shed yet. People still traded, talked through gestures, and shared cautious smiles. But the peaceful balance felt fragile. One wrong movement, one accidental insult, and everything could collapse. The Vikings began building larger defenses, stronger walls, deeper trenches, and lookout posts. Indigenous scouts responded by studying these fortifications, trying to understand Viking intentions. Both groups stood on opposite sides of a cultural gulf. Two civilizations meeting not as conquerors or victims, but as equals unsure of one another's hearts. The seeds of conflict had been planted, though neither side wanted war. The next events in Vinland's story would prove whether friendship or violence shaped the future of this fragile contact zone between worlds. As autumn faded into early winter, the Vikings began experiencing the first true test of their settlement in Vinland: the slow, tightening grip of cold weather. Although Vinland was much warmer than Greenland, winter still arrived with biting wind rolling off the sea, frost creeping through open fields, and river edges hardening with ice. At first, the Vikings celebrated the mild, early frost, believing this climate to be forgiving. The morning of departure arrived crisp and bright. A gentle wind rolled off the land and carried the scent of pine and salty water. The Vikings moved with coordinated urgency, though beneath their hurried steps flowed strong emotional currents. Each person understood that the next time they stepped on land, they would be back in the old world. A world smaller, colder, and less mysterious than Vinland. Launching the ships required teamwork and muscle. Logs were placed beneath the hulls to roll them toward the sea. Voices rose over crashing waves. Men shouting, women encouraging, children cheering. When the first ship slid into water, spray splashed across Leif Erikson's face. The moment felt like rebirth. Survival meant leaving, not clinging to impossible dreams. Once the ships were afloat, the settlers climbed aboard in groups. They positioned timber beneath the deck, secured rope bundles, stored food, and arranged families along the vessel's length. Shields lined the sides, not for battle, but for protection against waves. As they pushed away from the shore, voices cracked with emotion. Many stood watching Vinland shrink behind them. Green hills softened into shapes, the coastline blurred. Some men bowed their heads. Women held children tightly. A few warriors who once raged for war now whispered prayers. Soon, Vinland slipped beyond eyesight entirely, and the sea returned to its rightful place, final judge of human will. The Atlantic greeted them without sympathy. Waves towered unpredictably, smashing against hull planks. Storm winds roared for hours at a time. The ocean reminded them that though they had faced danger on land, the sea was equally capable of testing strength. Viking sailors worked tirelessly to keep the ships steady. They shortened sails in high winds, bailed water during storms, and strengthened rope knots constantly. Salt water stung their eyes and cut into their skin. Yet even a mild winter demanded strength, discipline, and social unity, which were becoming harder to maintain under the weight of tension with the indigenous population. During summer and fall, The Vikings had thrived on abundance. Endless fish, fresh berries, fruits, and game meat. But as weather cooled, many of those food sources diminished. Fish swam farther from shore, berries shriveled, and hunting became more laborious. The settlers felt uneasy, knowing winter scarcity could breed desperation. They rationed food carefully, storing dried fish and smoked venison in their wooden sheds. Some men requested larger rations, believing their work entitled them to more food. Leif refused. Fairness, he insisted, was the only way to preserve group morale. This internal struggle weakened the unity of the camp, while external relations with indigenous neighbors continued to deteriorate. Trade encounters grew less frequent. The once friendly indigenous visitors seemed more cautious, approaching only in small groups and not staying long. Their expressions became unreadable, sometimes suspicious, sometimes distant. The Vikings did not know whether this shift meant distrust, strategic caution, or simple seasonal migration. Another stress factor was psychological. As nights grew longer, fear magnified every sound. Men heard branches snapping outside camp walls and assumed it was hostile reconnaissance, not wildlife. Some nights, shadows danced between trees. The Vikings imagined tribes gathering in the forest, preparing for attack. Whether these fears were justified or fantasy remained unclear. The indigenous population possessed deep forest skills, so stealth was natural for them. To Viking minds, such hidden knowledge felt both incredible and terrifying. Communication failures also deepened conflict. With limited shared language, misunderstandings multiplied. The Vikings noticed that indigenous groups no longer accepted metal tools as eagerly as before. Perhaps they had collected enough for now. Or perhaps rumors spread that accepting too many gifts implied weakness. Vikings failed to understand. Instead, they interpreted withdrawal as insult. Inside the camp, debates raged about how to respond. Some men argued they should strike first to secure their presence before the indigenous population outnumbered and overwhelmed them. Others insisted violence would doom the settlement and bring dishonor. The community split into factions, threatening stability. Leif, maintaining discipline and reason, refused violent action. However, the fear spreading through camp transformed everyday tasks into opportunities for paranoia. Hunting expeditions demanded armed escorts. Fishing trips required lookouts. Night patrols doubled. These measures drained energy, making the long winter days run together into exhaustion. Men began dreaming restlessly of Greenland, where danger came from nature rather than tension between cultures. Despite hardships, Vinland remained livable, and certain comforts helped morale. The houses built from timber stayed warmer than Greenland homes. Fires burned steadily, surrounded by talk, storytelling, and song. Scandinavian sagas echoed through the halls at night, reminding the settlers of their heritage. Men recited tales of Odin wandering the world for wisdom, Thor defending Midgard from giants, and heroes who faced impossible odds with unshakable resolve. These stories encouraged them to perceive the dark season not as defeat, but challenge. Still, conflict loomed like a storm cloud. Neither culture fully understood the other, yet both understood fear. In this fragile environment, the smallest spark could ignite war. To understand how conflict grew in Vinland, we must look closely at the psychology of both cultures and how misunderstanding shaped every interaction. Vikings arrived in North America expecting emptiness, a land waiting for settlement. They knew cultures existed beyond Europe, but they did not truly grasp the complexity of the Americas. Every indigenous community they encountered had deep histories, oral traditions, and established territories. To them, Vikings were intruders attempting to build permanent homes on land already belonging to others. Yet both groups feared the other for reasons rooted in cultural worldview. Vikings, trained warriors since childhood, respected strength above all else. They valued courage, physical power, and martial skill. Seeing indigenous arrows lodged into trees near their camp felt like a challenge and a warning. They wondered whether the arrows meant stay back or prepare for war. Without language, symbols became dangerous. Indigenous communities, meanwhile, observed Viking behavior through their own cultural lens. They saw outsiders arriving with weapons made of metal rather than stone. They saw foreigners building permanent structures, storing food, cutting down forests, and establishing boundaries. To communities that believed land should be shared, not owned, Viking construction suggested domination rather than coexistence. Geography added to confusion. Indigenous groups moved seasonally, traveling between summer and winter grounds, following animal migrations. Vikings misinterpreted this seasonal absence as surrender or retreat. When fewer indigenous people visited the riverbanks in winter, Vikings believed they had frightened them away, when in truth, they had simply shifted camps as they always had. This misunderstanding led the Vikings to misjudge their position. Some believed they were stronger than the indigenous population because they had metal weapons. They did not realize they were vastly outnumbered in the larger regional context. Rumors grew daily. One Viking insisted he saw scouts drawing maps from the forest line. Another believed he heard whispering at night that sounded like warriors preparing attacks. The imagination became weaponized. Meanwhile, indigenous communities debated the meaning of Viking technology. To them, metal represented enormous power. They wondered how such outsiders forged tools without local materials and how many more ships might follow. They also feared disease, though unknowingly. Some illnesses passed subtly between cultures. Coughs and fevers appeared on both sides, mysterious and unexplained. As mistrust increased, the Vikings tightened their security. They no longer allowed indigenous individuals to freely approach homes or fire pits. They constructed lookout posts on hills, watching rivers constantly. This visible militarization changed indigenous attitudes. What began as curiosity now looked like invasion. Scouts reported that the newcomers stockpiled weapons. Cultural distance deepened through silence. Neither side could fully articulate truth, so suspicion replaced communication. In Viking thinking, asserting strength was the only way to avoid attack. In indigenous thinking, defensive organization was the only way to protect families. Both sides became mirrors of one another, guarding, watching, preparing. History remembers this period as quiet but full of fire beneath language. Both cultures believed they were acting in self-defense. Both believed the other held unfair advantage. Both assumed war might come. They were correct. The peace that had held, tenuous and trembling, finally shattered during a trading visit near the end of winter. The Vikings and a small indigenous group met along the riverbank, hoping to exchange food and tools. The Vikings brought iron knives, fish hooks, cloth, and a small carved wooden cup. Indigenous traders brought furs, dried fish, and carved ornaments. The exchange began smoothly at first, but desire and misunderstanding soon twisted intentions. A Viking reached for a fur cloak decorated with intricate bead patterns. He admired its craftsmanship and pointed toward his own knife, suggesting trade. The indigenous owner shook his head, refusing. To the Vikings, refusal felt insulting. In Norse culture, refusing a trade could imply weakness or disrespect, especially during a fair deal. The Viking, frustrated, raised his voice. The indigenous man responded sharply in his own language. No one understood each other's words, yet tone alone drew battle lines. Another Viking stepped forward angrily, touching his sword hilt. The gesture was instinctive, not intentional threat, but indigenous warriors reacted instantly, drawing bows. Leif shouted for calm, pushing men apart, yet tension had spiraled beyond control. Then chaos erupted. Accounts vary, but most interpretations suggest that a Viking weapon struck the ground, startling the indigenous group into believing an attack had begun. Arrows flew. One Viking fell, wounded in the shoulder. Screams echoed as battle instincts replaced diplomacy. Vikings charged, shields raised. Indigenous warriors retreated into forest cover, firing arrows from behind trees with speed and skill. The Vikings, outmatched in terrain familiarity, could not chase effectively. Arrows fell from all directions, forcing the Norse to retreat to camp. Once behind defenses, their wounded lay bleeding on wooden floors. There was shock, grief, and rage. For the Vikings, this moment proved their darkest fear. Peace had broken. Indigenous warriors, meanwhile, returned to their communities with confirmation of Viking aggression. They saw the newcomers as violent, dishonorable people who did not respect boundaries or cultural etiquette. Their stories spread through regional networks, warning other groups along the coast. Inside the Viking camp, the wounded man moaned through nightfall. Blood stained his tunic, and although the arrow was removed, infection threatened him. The crew spent the night sharpening weapons, reinforcing walls, and debating whether they should abandon Vinland entirely. Some shouted that the land, though beautiful, was cursed with conflict. Others believed surrendering would mean cowardice. Leif Erikson remained torn. His mission was exploration and trade, not conquest. His dream was coexistence. Yet circumstances had changed. The next days promised retaliation. Either the Vikings would march inland to assert dominance, or the indigenous groups would assemble larger forces. Either way, the fragile balance of early contact had ended. The first blood had been spilled, and history teaches that once violence begins between cultures with no shared language, peace becomes almost impossible. What happened next would determine whether Vinland remained a Norse dream, or collapsed in a legend stained with memory of conflict. The aftermath of the first violent clash left the Viking settlement silent and heavy with dread. The men who once laughed around evening fires now whispered cautiously, their eyes scanning the forest shadows beyond the walls. The wounded Viking survived the arrow wound, though he suffered fever and infection for weeks. His screams during the night intensified the sense of vulnerability. Leif Erikson walked between houses, speaking softly to families, reminding them to remain calm and united. Yet, even his leadership could not erase the truth. They were now a colony under threat. The first decision Leif made was increasing defenses. The camp walls, originally built to hold back wind, now needed to withstand arrows and attackers. Men chopped trees to form thicker barricades, sharpening the tops into spear-like points designed to deter climbers. They dug deeper trenches, filled them with sharpened stakes, and widened pathways to create clear lines of sight. Watchtowers were strengthened, allowing guards to look far into the forest and spot movement early. Viking defense strategy, shaped over centuries of warfare in Europe, gave them confidence. These were people trained to protect what they built. However, sheer numbers favored the indigenous population. Scouts reported seeing dozens of canoes along the riverbanks far from camp, evidence that multiple groups had gathered to discuss the Viking threat. The Norse knew they were outnumbered. Even with superior metal weapons, they could not win a prolonged battle against hundreds if war escalated. Men whispered about abandoning Vinland altogether, returning to Greenland before enemy forces surrounded them. Yet others, fueled by pride and belief in destiny, refused to leave. They argued that retreat would erase their accomplishments and shame their ancestors. Disagreement threatened internal unity. Some men urged a diplomatic attempt. Perhaps gifts or apologies might restore peace. Others, haunted by memories of the riverbank battle, believed indigenous warriors would never forgive bloodshed. They argued that appeasement would only make the Vikings appear weak. The camp became divided, though all still respected Leif as leader. His challenge was keeping the settlement together despite conflicting advice. Winter's cold worsened emotional strain. The frozen air seeped through wooden walls, chilling bones at night. Men burned more wood than expected, gradually draining forest resources near the settlement. Supplies dwindled faster than planned. Food consumption rose because fear increased appetite and work intensified. Scouts discovered that berry bushes and grapevines could no longer provide enough nutrition. Cattle and livestock brought from Greenland required constant feed, consuming resources meant for humans. Morale djupt painfully. Men argued, refused orders, and criticized decisions. In response, Leif reintroduced strict discipline, daily tasks, duty rotations, and weapon drills. He reminded them that Vikings survived centuries of war because they trained relentlessly. Sword practice resumed at dawn. Shield formations were rehearsed in the snow. The sound of steel striking would echo across the settlement like thunder. But even as men rebuilt their courage, one question haunted every mind. Would the indigenous peoples attack? Each night, scouts returned reporting distant drumming, chanting, and fires lighting the hills. To Viking ears, these sounds were war signals, though they may also have been ceremonies unrelated to conflict. Without language, fear filled meaning into silence. Some Vikings dreamed of ambushing nearby indigenous camps to establish dominance. Leif forbid it. He understood that Nordic aggression would destroy any chance of survival. Instead, he developed a new plan: reinforce the camp walls, prepare for a siege if necessary, survive winter, and attempt negotiations when warmer weather returned. Even the most violent Viking warriors recognized this strategy as wise. Still, isolation took a toll. They were thousands of miles from Greenland, surrounded by unfamiliar landscapes and cultures, without reinforcements. Their ships sat anchored at the coast, vulnerable to sabotage. Protecting them became top priority. Without ships, escape was impossible. Guards were posted day and night along the beach. Through cold winds and roaring fires, the months crawled by. Men clung to routine because routine meant stability. Every night, the camp sang old Norse songs to honor gods and ancestors, but voices trembled with fear hidden behind melody. Vinland was still paradise in beauty and resources, but paradise had teeth. The dream of peaceful settlement had become survival in a land watching them with wary, ancient eyes. While the Vikings fortified their walls, indigenous communities gathered inland to discuss the sudden threat presented by the newcomers. Oral tradition suggests that long before Viking arrival, tribes in the region communicated regularly across wide territories, sharing stories, trade goods, and warnings of danger. The arrival of metal-armed foreigners, building fortified settlements near valuable shorelines, threatened the balance of regional power. Even groups who initially greeted the Norse with curiosity reconsidered their stance after hearing of the first battle. Leaders from multiple communities met near rivers and forest clearings to weigh options. Their discussions were complex, not reactionary. They asked, who were these strangers? Why did they cut trees so aggressively? Why did they build permanent houses instead of roaming like seasonal visitors? Why did they carry weapons constantly? And most importantly, would more arrive? These questions held deep meaning. Indigenous peoples had experienced migrations and contacts before between neighboring tribes and sometimes between different language groups. But the Vikings represented a different kind of movement: abrupt arrival, settlement creation, and land transformation. It reminded many leaders of territorial dispute patterns already familiar within indigenous histories, where groups fought over hunting grounds or rivers. The difference was metal. Vikings wielded tools that sliced trees faster than stone axes and weapons that pierced animal hides more deeply than carved blades. This technology imbalance raised existential worries. If settlement continued, the newcomers could dominate crucial environmental resources. Tension escalated when young indigenous warriors returned from the river battlefield reporting that the Vikings fought fiercely, charging without hesitation and using shields to block arrows. Their discipline impressed and frightened listeners. While the battle itself had been small, its symbolism was enormous. It meant these strangers were willing to kill, not only trade. Indigenous councils debated diplomacy versus force. Some wished to communicate more clearly, attempting another peaceful exchange to ensure boundaries were respected. Others believed the Vikings represented a spreading disease, figuratively and literally, that must be stopped early. There were also ecological worries. The Vikings hunted deer heavily and caught large amounts of fish. They cut large patches of forest to build shelters and fuel fires. From an indigenous perspective, this was extraction without regard for long-term sustainability. These newcomers seemed disconnected from local laws of nature. This cultural misunderstanding, the belief that Vikings were intentionally destructive, deepened anger. In reality, Vikings followed the survival patterns from Greenland, where scarcity required heavy resource use. They did not realize such behavior disrupted indigenous ecological balance. Over time, multiple tribes formed an alliance focused on one shared goal: remove the Viking settlement to protect regional stability. The alliance was not built from hatred, but from caution and community responsibility. To indigenous leaders, the presence of armed foreigners was a spark threatening future generations. From their perspective, war preparation was defensive, not aggressive. Scouts were assigned to watch Viking movement night and day. Canoes traveled rivers silently, studying fortifications from afar. Arrows were crafted in large numbers. Warriors trained to approach quietly, using trees as cover. Meanwhile, the Vikings sensed increasing hostility without knowing its scale. They saw more figures watching from the forest line, more footprints leading away from campsites, and more smoke rising from inland fires. They had no idea that dozens, perhaps hundreds, of warriors were gathering. Despite their fatigue, their movements were precise, shaped by generations of maritime heritage. Men sang during rowing shifts, not to celebrate, but to sustain rhythm and morale. Old Norse verses echoed across rolling waves. Poetry of ancestors, memories of battles, and stories of gods who shaped the world from chaos. Each stroke of the oar pushed them farther from Vinland and closer to Greenland. However, the emotional journey was just as intense as the physical voyage. Time at sea forced reflection. Warriors questioned whether they had acted honorably in Vinland. Some regretted moments of anger or conflict. Others realized that indigenous peoples had simply protected their land, just as Vikings would have protected their own homelands. Such thoughts stirred humility. Vinland had changed them and made them wiser. Children spent long hours staring at sea birds circling above. Women braided rope fibers and cared for the wounded. The sea healing process seemed endless. Waves washed away trauma little by little. But no amount of distance erased memory. Nights brought cold and fear. The ocean roared beneath starless skies, and ships rocked violently. People dreamed of Vinland forests and indigenous arrows flying through fog. Even in the middle of the Atlantic, they carried the weight of that land's spirit. Still, hope remained strong. They told each other stories of Greenland's coast. Farmland, family members, and celebrations waiting. These stories warmed them better than fur blankets. The idea of stepping on home soil again made the unbearable bearable. Days passed before land birds began appearing, flying from the west. Vikings knew what that meant. Greenland was near. Hearts lifted. Voices grew louder. And beneath the joy flowed awe. They had crossed the ocean twice and lived. When the first outline of Greenland's coastline emerged against the horizon, the Vikings erupted into cheers. Being isolated, they assumed only one or two tribes existed nearby. They were dangerously wrong. Winter dragged on, turning the land into a silent battlefield waiting for spring to release its fury. The Vikings continued fortifying their camp, unaware that indigenous strategists were mapping weaknesses, examining how water supplies could be blocked, how boats could be burned, and how trenches might be breached. The stage was set for a larger conflict that neither side could avoid. Every passing day drew them closer to a clash shaped by cultural misunderstanding, ecological fear, and mutual struggle for survival. The first coordinated indigenous attack on the Viking settlement came unexpectedly, launched under the veil of early spring darkness. The snow had begun to melt, revealing damp soil and slick pathways leading from the forest into open fields. The Vikings, weary from winter, sat around fire pits, sharing meals, attempting to regain a sense of peace. Guards still watched the camp perimeter, but exhaustion dulled their senses. Months without attack had lulled some into believing conflict might fade. Just past midnight, the forest erupted with motion. From behind trees and brush, dozens of warriors emerged silently, their footsteps dampened by soft soil. They carried bows, stone-tipped arrows, spears, and leather shields. Many painted their faces with dark pigments to blend with night shadows. Their strategy was clear: strike quickly, weaken morale, and withdraw before Vikings could counterattack. The first volley of arrows cut through the darkness like streaks of lightning. Guards shouted warnings, horns sounded, and chaos exploded through the camp. Flames from central fire pits illuminated silhouettes running between houses. Arrows struck wooden walls, roofs, and storage sheds. Several Vikings fell before they fully understood what was happening. But the Viking instinct for battle triggered rapidly. Warriors grabbed shields, swords, and axes, rushing to defensive walls. They shouted commands, forming shield walls along the perimeter. Their metal weapons reflected firelight, intimidating attackers, but also making targets visible. Indigenous warriors responded by shifting positions constantly, firing from multiple angles to confuse defense. The sound of feet pounding earth, shields clashing, and arrows snapping echoed across Vinland's night sky. For the first time, the settlement felt like a battlefield rather than a home. Smoke thickened the air as torches flew toward buildings. One storage shed caught fire, forcing Vikings to choose between fighting and saving their food supply. Half the defenders rushed to extinguish flames, leaving the perimeter weaker. Indigenous attackers exploited this, rushing closer and hurling spears at the wooden walls. Inside the camp, women and children huddled behind houses, praying to Christian saints or calling on Old Norse gods. Panic swept through them. Some begged Leif to flee, others clung to hope. But Leif Erikson did not retreat. He moved tirelessly among fighters, encouraging them to hold formation. His calm voice cut through fear. The siege might have succeeded if not for one advantage: Viking armor. Indigenous arrows, though deadly, struggled to pierce chainmail and thick shields. Many Vikings survived hits that would have killed unarmored men. Realizing this, Indigenous warriors focused on strategic retreat to avoid heavy casualties. Their objective was not to destroy the camp in one night. It was to send a message: we are here, we are strong, and we will return. As dawn approached, attackers vanished into the forest, silent as they had arrived. The Vikings stood trembling, covered in sweat, blood, and ash. Their camp was wounded, damaged walls, burned supplies, several men injured, one dead. But the worst wound was psychological. They now understood the scale of Indigenous strength and coordination. Exhausted, they tended to the injured, patched walls, and buried their fallen companion. Leif realized something undeniable. Vinland was no longer a frontier dream. It was a battleground, and unless a miracle intervened, the war would only escalate. The morning after the night ambush arrived gray and heavy, a dawn weighed down by exhaustion and grief. Smoke from half-burned buildings hung stubbornly over Leif's butter, forming a veil between the survivors and the sun. Everyone moved slowly, not because of laziness, but because every limb ached from sleepless terror. The Vikings knew their world had changed. They had crossed a sea to reach paradise, but paradise had become a battlefield. The men tended to the wounded, their hands shaking as they stitched flesh and prepared poultices of herbs mixed with melted fat. Infection threatened every injury. One careless cut could end a life in a land far from doctors or deep knowledge of medicine. The first major task was honoring the fallen. Vikings believed deeply in proper burial, whether Christian or pagan. The man killed in the night attack was laid upon a wooden board near the camp center. Some prayed to Christ for his soul's peace. Others whispered the names of Valhalla and Odin. This blending of beliefs reflected the Vikings' identity during this era, caught between old gods and new faith, between tradition and transformation. Leif allowed both practices without judgment. Understanding unity mattered more than theology. After burial, Leif assembled his men to speak openly. His voice carried across the settlement, not by shouting, but by firm, controlled strength. We stand alive because we are not weak. Last night we faced warriors who know this forest better than their own blood. They struck with skill and silence. They will strike again, but we are Vikings. We did not cross storms and seas to surrender. His words steadied the camp. Men nodded slowly, shoulders straightening. They needed leadership now more than ever, and Leif provided it. However, even the strongest voice could not change reality. Their situation was deteriorating. Several houses needed repair. Food stores had burned, and a significant portion of their dried fish had been ruined by smoke and trampling. The loss meant hunger in the months ahead. The wounded required constant attention, forcing healthy men to work double duties. Sleep became rare, and paranoia flourished. Some warriors insisted on sleeping in armor despite the discomfort, fearing surprise attack every night. Inside Leif's hall, strategy discussions took place. A few argued for immediate retaliation. March into the forest, surprise indigenous camps, prove dominance. Leif rejected this violently. We do not know their numbers, he told them. To hunt enemies in their own forest is to walk blind into death. His caution saved lives, but anger simmered. 4 Vikings raised to value courage. Restraint looked like cowardice. The cultural weight of masculinity hung thick over every conversation. Outside the hall, ordinary tasks became a struggle. Gathering water meant exposing oneself outside the walls. Chopping wood meant venturing into the tree line. Hunting became almost impossible. Men moved in groups of 4 or 5 now, never alone. The settlement grew quieter, rhythm interrupted by anxiety. Even laughter felt dangerous, as though sound might attract arrows. The psychological impact ran deepest. Before the ambush, Vikings believed the indigenous population was fragmented and manageable. Now, they understood the truth. Powerful networks existed among these peoples, and they communicated swiftly and effectively. These weren't isolated hunters. They were organized societies defending ancestral land. Leif spent long nights awake, pacing the settlement like a restless wolf. He weighed decisions that could alter history. Should he abandon Vinland and return to Greenland with the timber and knowledge they had gathered? Should he stand firm, risking the lives of every man to preserve a dream? Or should he attempt diplomacy once more and hope for forgiveness from a people who had every reason to distrust them? He knew one thing for certain. The Vikings had reached the turning point. Vinland had once looked like a gift, but now it demanded sacrifice. Following the ambush, Leif and his advisors knew that simple defense would not be enough. Waiting behind walls meant the enemy controlled momentum, and Vikings never allowed themselves to be prey. They needed a plan that used intelligence, not just muscle. So Leif ordered 3 major strategic directions: a diplomatic attempt, adjustments to territorial routine, and new defensive infrastructure that would give them a tactical edge. The first step was diplomacy. Despite the violence, Leif believed communication was still possible. He ordered small gift bundles made from iron nails, glass beads, and cloth. These were placed along riverbanks where indigenous scouts had been seen before. Attached to the bundles were icons drawn in the dirt, spirals, circles, and lines intended to signal peace and trade. The intent was to show that the Vikings still preferred exchange over war. Whether those symbols were understood or not, no one could know. Days passed without reply. Some gifts disappeared silently, suggesting they had been taken. Others remained untouched. The second step was to change movement patterns. Vikings stopped using predictable routes to gather resources. Instead, they rotated travel paths around the camp, laid false footprints, and doubled back frequently. They altered hunting times randomly, ensuring enemy scouts could not track when defenses were weakest. Leif implemented night patrol rotations, ensuring every hour saw new eyes watching the forest edges. Their strategies resembled modern guerrilla precautions, showing how adaptive Viking thought could be under pressure. Then came the physical fortification. The Vikings enhanced their walls with a double barrier, 2 layers of sharpened stakes with a trench between them, filled with sharpened branches and stones. They built firing slits into the wall to allow bowmen to shoot arrows without exposing their bodies. They also placed hidden traps outside the perimeter, pits covered with grass, intended to injure anyone trying to approach silently. These improvements consumed labor, sweat, and injuries, but they gave the Vikings hope. They also prepared for siege warfare. Water barrels were stored inside, wells were dug deeper, and secret escape tunnels were discussed. Smoke holes above houses were widened to allow indoor fires with less detection risk. They planned what to do if food dropped dangerously low, which animals to slaughter first, which non-essential goods could be burned to warm homes. Leif even spoke of rationing alcohol, which caused outrage, but sobriety meant clearer minds in battle. The greatest fear remained unseen attack during the night. To counter this, Leif ordered perimeter fires to burn at dusk, illuminating the camp exterior. The fires projected Viking shadows into the forest, creating illusions of greater numbers than they had. Indigenous warriors, watching from the trees, realized the settlement was no longer easy to approach unseen. Inside the camp, weapon production intensified. Smiths hammered heated iron into arrowheads and spear tips using makeshift forges. Men practiced shield walls every morning, turning snowy fields into training grounds. Even non-warriors, farmers, traders, and laborers learned combat skills. There would be no unarmed victims next time. Meanwhile, scouts sent north and south along the coastline returned with important information. No other Viking ships had arrived. Reinforcements were not coming. They stood alone in a continent vast beyond imagination. The ocean behind them separated them from help, and the forest ahead separated them from allies. Still, they continued, not because they believed victory was certain, but because surrender felt worse than death. Their ancestors crossed frozen seas and mountains. Fear was a luxury Vikings had no right to indulge. Every man in Vinland felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. They did not know future generations would read their story and wonder whether courage or stubbornness drove them. All they understood was survival, day by day, night by night, prayer by prayer. The second major clash between Vikings and indigenous forces unfolded not at the settlement itself, but along a river now remembered in Norse storytelling as the Silent River. It began when supplies reached dangerously low late in spring. Hunting and fishing parties had to travel farther to gather enough food. And though everyone feared ambush, starvation posed a greater threat. A group of 12 Vikings left Leif's Butter before dawn to fish along the river miles from camp. They believed early morning fog would conceal them. Carrying spears, nets, and shields, they moved quietly beneath towering trees. For the first few hours, everything seemed peaceful. They filled baskets with fish and felt relief, enough catch to feed the settlement for days. But just as they began preparing to return, the forest fell silent. Birds stopped calling. Wind stopped moving branches. The Vikings felt the change instantly. Silence was nature's alarm bell. Arrows flew first, dozens slicing the fog like ghost weapons. 3 Vikings fell instantly, their bodies dropping without a sound. The survivors ran toward the riverbank, shields lifted. Indigenous warriors emerged from behind rocks, moving with precision. They had studied Viking tactics and knew where their armor left openings. One Viking shouted for retreat, but another refused. Panic split them. In those seconds, the ambush intensified. Warriors used the forest as shield, appearing and vanishing between trees. The Vikings fought back fiercely, driving their enemies toward the hill with shield pushes and axe swings. But every blow cost precious strength. One Viking, Halder, was cornered. Instead of surrendering, he swung his axe with his last strength, cutting through a spear shaft. He roared his ancestor's name, but an arrow pierced his throat. His body fell into the river and vanished beneath the surface, drifting downstream. His brothers shouted his name until voices cracked. The remaining Vikings formed a shield circle, a last-stand formation rarely used outside legendary battles. They placed injured men in the center and braced shields outward. Arrows rattled against wood, metal, and flesh. One man broke formation and tried to run. A spear reached his back before he made 3 steps. The fight lasted minutes, though to survivors it felt like hours. Realizing arrows alone couldn't break the shield circle, Indigenous warriors advanced with clubs and short stone blades. Close combat erupted. Axes clashed against stone, shields splintered, men fell screaming. Only 4 Vikings survived. Bloody, weaponless, shaking from shock, they retreated toward camp carrying nothing but fear. Their return broke morale inside Leifsbutter. Women wept openly. Warriors pounded their fists against walls, shouting for immediate revenge. But revenge would be suicide. The ambush had revealed an unmistakable truth. The Indigenous peoples held mastery over terrain, numbers, and tactics. This battle ignited one final realization. Vinland would not welcome them. The land was rich, but not theirs to claim. The future of the settlement stood at a crossroads. Fight until extinction, or leave paradise behind forever. Leif Erikson stared into the fire that night and understood the weight of command like never before. He had led his men across the ocean into danger. Now he must lead them out alive. The days following the disastrous Silent River ambush reshaped the atmosphere inside Leifsbutter more completely than any previous event. It was not only the physical loss of 8 men that weighed on the community, but the psychological gravity of the message carved into that tragedy. The Vikings were not merely facing scattered warriors reacting to isolated incidents. They were facing a unified response from a sophisticated, determined Indigenous alliance. The Silent River clash shattered any remaining illusion that the Norse might one day dominate Vinland through strength alone. Inside the camp, grief mixed with fear to create a thick fog of despair. The survivors of the ambush walked as though decades older, unable to forget the sounds of death at the riverbank. Their stories replayed through the settlement again and again. Arrows emerging out of nothing, shadows attacking from every direction, warriors who moved faster than the eye could follow. Each retelling made the enemy seem larger, more numerous, and impossible to defeat. For people who once believed battles were heroic tests of individual bravery, this new style of combat felt alien and terrifying. Leif Erikson bore the heaviest emotional burden. He had chosen who would travel to the river, and therefore he felt responsible for their deaths. Leaders in Viking society carried glory when decisions brought success, but they also carried crushing guilt when those decisions led to bloodshed. After the ambush, Leif's posture changed. His shoulders slumped, his voice deepened, and his eyes revealed a fatigue even sleep could not cure. At night, he walked alone to the edge of the camp, staring into dark forests that whispered ancient secrets, trying to imagine the world from the enemy's perspective. He thought of Greenland and Iceland, of the long lineage of sailors who pushed westward because possibility offered more than fear ever could. He thought of his father, Erik the Red, and wondered whether Erik would have continued the mission or abandoned it after such resistance. Leif believed exploration was a divine calling, first from Odin in tradition, later from Christ in spirit. But faith alone could not blind him to the reality that his men were dying in a land never promised to them. Meanwhile, conversations inside longhouses revealed growing division. Some Vikings argued they must stay and fight, believing the loss of blood required revenge to reclaim honor. Others insisted the land was cursed or protected by spirits, and that leaving would fulfill destiny more honorably than dying pointlessly. Women asked what would happen to their children if the camp fell. Elders whispered that life in Greenland, though harsh and icy, at least belonged to the Norse. The clash of ideas created tension not only between families, but within personal identities. Vikings had always defined themselves by conquest, discovery, and resilience. But Vinland forced a new question. Could survival mean retreat? Could bravery include knowing when to leave? This moral complexity had never existed in sagas before. They spoke of victory or death, not strategic withdrawal. Leif listened to every argument without interrupting. the ability to absorb conflict quietly, to let emotion burn out before deciding, marked his unique leadership style. Eventually, he addressed the camp and spoke plainly. "We came here to find a future. We must now ask whether death is that future." His words, simple yet powerful, shifted the emotional balance. For the first time, men openly discussed the possibility of returning to Greenland. The Norse, accustomed to chieftain rule, may have misunderstood these political systems entirely. They interpreted diplomatic silence as weakness, not strategic patience. Economically, indigenous peoples maintained trade networks far older and wider than Norse commerce. Birch bark canoes traveled inland waterways linking distant regions. Elaborate trade routes passed tobacco, turquoise, obsidian, and copper across continents. Norse material culture, if acquired by indigenous groups, could have traveled south through these pathways. It is possible that Norse metals reached communities the Vikings never saw. Spiritually, indigenous societies carried cosmological beliefs that tied humans to land. They saw forests, rivers, and mountains not as property, but as living relatives. This worldview shaped resistance to Viking settlement. To them, strangers cutting sacred trees threatened balance. That moral dimension drives understanding of Vinland conflict. Indigenous warriors defended spiritual order, not simply territory. Thus, Vinland sits inside larger American civilization canvas. Vikings did not mark beginning of North American history. They intersected with one page of a massive book already centuries long. Recognizing this elevates Vinland's story from European achievement in a shared global heritage. It reframes Vikings not as bringers of civilization, but as visitors to a continent already thriving with culture, knowledge, and identity. The importance of Vinland reaches far beyond Viking heritage. Its existence reshaped humanity's understanding of world geography, cultural possibility, and historical identity. Before Vinland, Europeans imagined the Atlantic as boundary, final wall preventing access to unknown west. Vikings removed that wall. They proved the world did not end at horizon. They proved ocean was passable, not infinite abyss. Even though medieval Europe did not fully recognize the discovery at the time, future generations inherited psychological permission to dream westward. Vinland influenced global imagination in subtle ways. Early medieval mapmakers, uncertain what lay across Atlantic, began sketching phantom islands beyond Iberia. Later European writers incorporated western lands into myth cycles. Avalon, High Brazil, the Island of Saints, mirroring Vinland whisper beneath cultural consciousness. Even when not named directly, Vinland carved shape of possibility. This psychological shift made Columbus think differently centuries later. When he approached the Spanish crown, he carried idea, not proof, that Western land existed. He lacked full knowledge of Norse voyages, but medieval intellectual circles preserved enough rumor to keep idea alive. Thus, Vinland indirectly influenced world history by planting seeds that sprouted during Age of Exploration. But Vinland also shaped modern science. Archaeology, linguistics, climate geology, genetic mapping, and maritime engineering all use Vinland as case study. It teaches scholars how humans move across oceans without compasses, how cultures interact across ecological boundaries, and how oral histories survive millennia. It teaches humility. Many truths considered myth later prove factual. Vinland influences cultural identity among Scandinavians, Indigenous Americans, and transatlantic descendants. It offers pride, narrative resilience, and opportunity for intercultural respect. Rather than glorifying conquest, modern interpretation highlights coexistence possibilities and recognizes indigenous sovereignty. It challenges old colonial myths by showing Europeans were not supreme conquerors. They were visitors who failed to dominate North America. This recognition shifts ethical conversation around discovery. On philosophical level, Vinland proves that human history is nonlinear. Civilizations rise and fall, cultures meet and separate. Knowledge spreads unevenly. Vikings reached North America many centuries before European colonization, yet the event did not transform the world immediately. History unfolds through complex timing, not simple steps. Vinland also offers metaphor. Every society contains uncharted territory. Every generation faces unknown horizon. Vikings pushed into literal sea. Modern societies push into space, digital worlds, genetic exploration. Human instinct remains the same, seeking possibility beyond boundary. Through Vinland, we recognize continuity of courage across ages. Finally, Vinland carries emotional legacy for all humanity. It reveals that contact between cultures does not always produce victory or defeat. Sometimes history pauses. Sometimes discovery exists long before conquest. Vinland teaches humility about technological progress. Even advanced maritime societies can fail to hold new territory if spiritual, political, and ecological contexts oppose them. That lesson matters today. When we face global challenges, climate change, cultural conflict, resource scarcity, Vinland reminds us success requires balance between human ambition and natural reality. Vikings did not leave America because they lacked bravery. They left because world complexity exceeded will. Understanding that truth invites compassion for past generations and wisdom for future ones. So, Vinland does not belong to Scandinavia alone, nor to Canada alone, nor to sagas alone. It belongs to world consciousness, a memory proving humanity has always been bigger than maps, driven by dreams larger than coastlines, and shaped by contact deeper than conquest. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Viking Vinland story is that it did not appear from nowhere. It emerged organically from a larger network of Norse societies operating across the North Atlantic. Iceland, Greenland, Norway, the Faroe Islands, and Vinland formed a loose but dynamic cultural system bound together through shared identity, trade flow, and emotional lineage. To understand Vinland fully, we must examine how Norse life in the Atlantic unfolded centuries before and after Leif Erikson's voyage. The Norse Atlantic expansion began in the 9th century, when Norwegian families sailed westward in search of space and independence. Iceland became the first major settlement frontier, drawing adventurous individuals fleeing political pressure or seeking land ownership. Once Iceland became successful, with legal system known as the Althing and strong cultural infrastructure, settlers continued outward to Greenland around 985 CE, led by Erik the Red. Here, they constructed farms, churches, and trade centers. Greenland became stepping stone to the west, both geographically and psychologically. The sheer fact that people thrived in one of the harshest climates on Earth created a civilization defined by resilience. Without Greenland, Vinland would not have happened. Greenlanders required timber, iron, livestock fodder, and material resources unavailable locally. Every Greenlandic household battled seasonal starvation, unpredictable hunting cycles, and isolation. These pressures generated constant outward thinking. Voyages to Markland, Labrador, and Helgeland, Baffin Island, may have occurred regularly for timber acquisition long before or after Leif's famous trip. This idea reframes Vinland not as isolated adventure, but as continuation of expanding logistical corridor. Communication routes connected these societies. Ships deliver goods such as walrus ivory, soapstone, furs, and hides between Greenland and Europe. In return, Greenlanders received metal tools, cloth, grain, and Christian texts. Icelandic poets traveled to Norway and Denmark to perform sagas, carrying cultural identity across kingdoms. Letters from bishops crossed sea lanes, strengthening spiritual unity. Through these networks, knowledge of Western regions spread organically. Vinland was discussed not in royal courts alone, but in marketplaces, farms, and fishing camps. The Norse world also included emotional relationships. Families stretched across the Atlantic. A man in Greenland might have siblings in Iceland, cousins in Norway, and grandparents remembered in Shetland. Vinland added more dimension to these networks. Settlers who left Greenland for America carried family honor and expectation. When a Vinland settlement failed, disappointment flowed through households across multiple regions. Some communities felt betrayed by those who returned. Others felt grateful that survivors came home alive. Trade networks shaped settlement planning. Vinland wood was valuable because Greenland lacked trees. One successful voyage returning with timber could support dozens of households. Archaeologists believe this economic motive remained strong even after full settlement attempts stopped. Vinland may have developed in a seasonal logging camp if indigenous conflict had not restricted activity. Culturally, the Atlantic Norse world shared language, style, legal structure, and belief system. Old Norse language formed linguistic bridge between distant places. Sagas provided historical memory for all. Christianization crossed sea lanes, binding spiritual identity. Pagan echoes remained powerful in Icelandic tradition, even as Christianity spread. In Vinland, settlers carried both belief systems into new environment. This interconnected world meant that no action was isolated. When Vikings cut wood in Vinland, the repercussions radiated into Greenland storehouses, Icelandic poem verses, and Norwegian trade ambitions. Vinland was not a lonely outpost. It was final extension of Western expansion chain. The site carried layers of meaning, safety, familiarity, and proof that their journey had succeeded. Families pointed excitedly toward mountains dusted with snow. Children shouted names of villages. Even the ocean seemed calmer, as though welcoming them home. As the ships approached the harbor, villagers rushed to the shore. News had spread quickly. Leif Erikson and his Vinland explorers were returning. People waved, threw their hands into the air, and shouted blessings across the waves. The arriving sailors, exhausted beyond imagination, felt tears burn behind their eyes. They were alive. They had stories no other Europeans on Earth possessed. Once the Vikings stepped onto Greenland shores, chaos of celebration began. Families reunited, wives embracing husbands, children clinging to fathers, friends slapping backs and laughing with relief. Feasting preparations began immediately. Community members hauled barrels of ale, roasted meat over open fire pits, and decorated halls with greenery. But beneath the joy lay darker truths. People noticed that only a fraction of the original Vinland crew had returned. Questions spilled through the crowd. What happened? Who died? Was the land cursed? Was there war? The explorers answered carefully. They told of paradise, grapes hanging from vines, thick forests full of timber, rivers bursting with salmon, soil fertile enough to feed generations. They described Markland and Helgeland, proving beyond doubt that North America existed and could be reached by Norse ships. But they also told of conflict, fierce indigenous warriors, night ambushes, and battles fought through fog. They spoke respectfully, not boasting of victory nor lying about defeat. They admitted indigenous tactics were brilliant, that their numbers were strong, that their land belonged to them long before Vikings saw it. Many villagers listened in awe, stunned by the magnitude of this cultural encounter. Leif Erikson did not glorify war. Instead, he emphasized wisdom. We did not fail. We discovered a world no one thought real. But that world was not ours to take. Those words echoed across Greenland. Some agreed with Leif, praising his leadership. Others believed the Vikings should return with more ships and conquer Vinland. But reality made that impossible. Greenland lacked resources, manpower, and political support to wage war across the Atlantic. The timing in history was not right. The saga of Vinland became legend almost instantly. Skalds wrote songs inspired by the voyage. Children gathered around fire pits to hear stories about Leifsbutter. Word traveled to Iceland, then Norway. Kings listened with interest but hesitated to act. The idea of Western land fascinated leaders, yet the cost and danger discouraged investment. Meanwhile, the Vinland explorers adjusted to Greenland life again. Simple routines felt luxurious after months in danger. sleeping without fear of attack, eating in communal halls, and walking among neighbors offered deep relief. Yet the return also carried sadness. Many felt restless, changed by Vinland forever. They missed the warm winds and green hills. They missed the strange sense of possibility. They also mourned their fallen companions. Families held ceremonies to honor the dead. Names were carved into wood and stone. Leif Erikson personally visited every grieving family, apologizing and sharing memories. Vinland faded from physical sight, but not from cultural memory. It lived inside Norse hearts as proof that the world stretched wider than maps showed. Elders whispered that future generations might return one day, perhaps under peaceful circumstances and stronger diplomacy. The seeds of long-term transatlantic imagination had been planted. The story did not end with return. It only transformed. Viking culture, once shaped by raids and conquest, now evolved into exploration and global curiosity. Vinland gave Scandinavia something priceless, a new identity. And those centuries would pass before the world understood the magnitude of this discovery. The truth remained. Europeans had reached North America around the year 1000 CE, not by accident, but by courage. News of Vinland spread through Greenland faster than the spring thaw across the fjords. Word passed from homestead to homestead. Leif Erikson had returned with a story that shattered the known world. People who had lived their entire lives believing the ocean marked the end of civilization now learned there were vast lands beyond the Western Sea. Farmers paused mid-work, fishermen lowered nets to the shore, and merchants listened wide-eyed. The very geography of their understanding shifted. For a culture shaped by exploration, this revelation created a sensation unlike anything before. The Greenland community hung on every detail of Leif's report. Families invited him into homes, asking about forest size, river shape, and soil richness. They asked whether the air tasted different, whether the stars shone the same, whether the trees sighed in wind the way Greenland trees did. People wanted Vinland to feel real to them, something they could hold in imagination. The more the story spread, the more individuals began picturing themselves there. Vinland, at first a foreign shore, became a dream woven into Greenland's cultural identity. But not everyone saw opportunity. Elders who believed in fate and caution warned that land discovered through bloodshed must not be touched again. They argued that the ocean gave and took at will. Perhaps Vinland existed to test Viking pride. These elders remembered how Erik the Red's legacy came from exile. They carried the memory of violence shaping Greenland and feared repeating tragedy. Had immediate hostility defined relationship, violent confrontation would have erupted daily, not episodically. Trade implies that both sides understood benefit of non-aggression. Fifth, cultural borrowing patterns hint at brief cross-learning. Norse accounts record Vikings using canoes to explore river systems, technology learned by observing indigenous design. Meanwhile, indigenous groups received metal tools, perhaps knife blades or nails, improving their own craftsmanship. Mutual borrowing suggests contact deeper than enemies firing arrows from trees. However, peace may have been fragile and conditional. Diplomatic coexistence required careful respect. Small misinterpretations could, and did, lead to disaster. For example, saga accounts show trade encounter collapsing when an indigenous man tried to take Viking weapon. To Norse warriors, this action signified theft and disrespect. To indigenous eyes, it may have been innocent interest. Cultural misunderstanding detonated peace. Power imbalance contributed to breakdown. Vikings assumed permanent settlement. Indigenous people assumed visiting rights. Once they realized intentions differed, tolerance shrank. Despite failure of long-term peace, early harmony matters. It reminds us that history rarely begins with battle. People usually attempt coexistence before conflict erupts. The first interactions in Vinland likely involved curiosity. Children watching strangers from trees, women studying Viking clothing, and men listening to unfamiliar language sound patterns. Music, laughter, and hand gestures may have once filled space where later silence settled. Recognizing early peace also challenges stereotypes. Vikings were not simply invaders. They attempted diplomacy.